November 10th, 1975. A 729-foot ship carrying 26,000 tons of iron ore is 17 minutes from disappearing forever, and not one person on board knows it yet. No mayday call, no wreckage on the surface, no survivors, not one, out of a crew of 29 men who were joking with another ship's captain less than half an hour earlier. Lake Superior doesn't give up its dead, sailors used to say, and that lake had already proven it hundreds of times before this night. We're going to walk through the last 17 minutes of the Edmund Fitzgerald, minute by minute, exploring the theories and evidence about what might have happened. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what her crew heard, said, and didn't say in the 17 minutes before Lake Superior closed over them. For 17 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the biggest thing on the Great Lakes. Launched in 1958, she stretched 729 feet, longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. She set cargo records almost every season, hauling more iron ore in a single trip than any ship before her. Crews called her the Fitz. The press called her the Titanic of the Great Lakes, a nickname earned for her size and her fame, not for anything ominous. Towns along her route timed their evenings by her horn. She was a local celebrity, painted a deep reddish hull, gleaming white pilot house, the pride of the fleet that owned her. That reputation for invincibility was about to be tested by a lake that had already claimed thousands of ships before her. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, and it behaves less like a lake and more like an inland sea. More than 350 known shipwrecks rest on its floor, and historians think the real number is higher. The water stays around 40 degrees Fahrenheit even in summer. Fall into it without protection, and hypothermia can set in within minutes, sometimes before a rescue boat can even reach you. Storms here build fast, sometimes in under an hour, funneling down from Canada with almost no warning. Sailors had a name for the worst stretch of the season, the gales of November. In November of 1975, that reputation was about to earn one more name. November 9th, 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald sat low in the water at the Burlington Northern Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. Over the previous 6 hours, loading crews had poured 26,116 tons of taconite pellets into her cargo holds, ore destined for the steel mills at Zug Island near Detroit. It was a run the Fitz had made 748 times since she launched in 1958. 17 years of shuttling iron ore down from the western tip of Lake Superior, through the Sioux Locks, across Huron, and down into Detroit. The crew called it milk run work. By 2:15 p.m., the hatches were sealed, and Captain McSorley filed his departure plan. 350 miles east, weather stations were already logging pressure drops. Nobody loading her that afternoon knew a storm was already gathering exactly where she was headed. Ernest Michael McSorley was 63 years old that November, a 44-year veteran of the Great Lakes who'd started as a deckhand in 1931. He'd commanded the Fitzgerald for 3 years and earned a reputation as a captain who kept schedules even when other ships turned back. Other captains called him steady but aggressive. In 1974, he'd run the Fitz through 25-foot seas when half the fleet was anchored. He knew Superior better than most men knew their own neighborhoods, every shoal and every weather pattern. This was supposed to be one of his final runs before retirement. He had 29 men under his command and a delivery deadline that didn't account for weather delays. His decisions in the next 24 hours would be studied for decades, but that night, he was just doing what he always did. 29 men sailed with McSorley that trip. First mate Jack McCarthy, 62, who'd worked Lakes Freight since 1938. Second mate James Pratt, 44. Third mate Michael Armagost, just 37 years old. Chief Engineer George Hall ran an engine room crew of 8, men who worked 4-hour watches in 110-degree heat among the boilers. The deck crew included veterans like watchman John Simmons, 63, and younger men like porter Thomas Edwards, 50. Deckhand Carl Peckel was 20 years old. Maintenance man Ransom Cundy was 53. For most of them, this was the last run of the season before the lakes froze and they went home for winter. Some had families waiting in port cities around Michigan and Ohio. Others lived alone in boarding houses between seasons. None of them had seen the marine forecast issued at 2:00 p.m. that afternoon. 29 men, 1 ship, and a storm system the National Weather Service hadn't fully understood yet. At 2:00 p.m. on November 9th, the National Weather Service posted a gale warning for Lake Superior. Winds of 35 to 50 knots, waves building through the evening. To the men on the Fitzgerald, that forecast wasn't a red flag. It was Tuesday. Captain McSorley had crossed this lake in far worse. Autumn gales were practically scheduled events on the Great Lakes, and the shipping season ran right through them because the money was in November, not June. So at 2:15 p.m., right on schedule, the Fitzgerald backed away from the dock in Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with 26,116 tons of taconite pellets. It was a normal call, made the normal way, by a captain with 44 years on the water. But this wasn't going to be a routine gale. It was about to become something the forecasters themselves hadn't predicted. About 2 hours behind the Fitzgerald, another freighter left port on nearly the same route, the Arthur M. Anderson, 767 feet long, under Captain Jesse Cooper, pulled out of Two Harbors, Minnesota, also bound east across Superior. The two ships weren't traveling together, not officially, but on a lake this size, in weather like this, captains kept an eye on each other's positions out of habit. It was standard practice, not friendship, just two crews doing the same job on the same stretch of water. Nobody on the Anderson thought much about the Fitzgerald that afternoon. It was just another freighter, a few miles ahead, riding the same swells. These two ships would spend the next day and a half talking to each other, and one of them would stop answering. Overnight, the storm did something the forecasters hadn't planned for. The low-pressure system crossing from Oklahoma into the lakes was supposed to weaken as it moved. Instead, it fed on the warm water of Superior and got stronger, fast. By early morning on November 10th, the Weather Service scrapped the gale warning and issued a storm warning instead. Winds now expected past 50 knots. But the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were already well out on open water, hours from any shelter, committed to the crossing. Radio chatter between ships started picking up, captains comparing notes on wind speed and swell. The barometer readings coming back were the kind that make veteran sailors go quiet. By morning, the numbers coming out of that system would make experienced captains recalculate everything. McSorley made his call early. Instead of hugging the southern shore where most freighters ran for cover, he'd take the Fitzgerald north, out across the open middle of the lake, toward Canadian waters. It was a known trick among Great Lakes captains. Hug the north shore near Isle Royale and the Canadian coastline, and the land itself blocks some of the wind, cuts down the fetch, gives a ship a little more shelter from the worst of the swell. The route would take the Fitzgerald up past Michipicoten Island, then down along the eastern shore toward Whitefish Bay, hundreds of miles of open water, with land only part of the way. That route was meant to protect her. Instead, it would put her closer to danger than anyone realized. By the morning of November 10th, the National Weather Service upgraded its warning. Gale became storm. Winds that had been pushing 40 knots were now clocked past 50, gusts even higher, and the waves behind them were climbing past 10 feet and still building. Both the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were already committed. They were too far out for a quick run back to Duluth, and the nearest shelter, Whitefish Bay, was still hours away at the speed a loaded ore carrier could manage. On a normal lake crossing, a captain might duck behind an island, wait out a squall, let it pass. Superior in November doesn't always give you that option, not once you're this far from shore, with a storm system this size bearing down. Neither captain turned back, and within hours, one of them would have a reason to wish he had. Around midday, the two ships' paths began to converge. The Anderson, slower and riding lighter, watched the Fitzgerald pull ahead, her silhouette getting smaller against a sky that kept darkening. Both boats were running the same northerly line now, close enough that Anderson's crew could track her on radar and catch her running lights when visibility allowed it. It was the kind of company sailors liked in weather like this. Another set of eyes, another voice on the radio. Captain Cooper aboard the Anderson kept half his attention on his own deck and half on the ship several miles ahead, the two of them trading position reports as the swells kept climbing under both hulls. For the next several hours, the Anderson would be the only other vessel that ever heard from her again. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley's voice came over the radio to the Anderson. He reported topside damage, a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and the ship had developed a list. He asked Captain Cooper to stay close. The pumps were running fine, he said, but he wanted the Anderson within range as they both pushed toward Whitefish Bay. His tone was calm, professional, the way a 44-year veteran sounds when he's managing a problem. Cooper acknowledged and held his course. The two ships were now unofficially paired, the Anderson trailing several miles behind, both captains watching the same storm build around them. McSorley didn't sound worried, but he also didn't sound like he wanted to be alone. A list on a ship this size wasn't supposed to be dangerous, but it was the first sign something below deck had already gone wrong. A list means the ship is leaning to one side. On a vessel as large as the Fitzgerald, 729 feet long, and loaded with 26,116 tons of taconite pellets, that tilt comes from imbalance. Either water has entered a compartment it shouldn't be in, or cargo has shifted, or both. The hull was divided into ballast tanks and cargo holds, designed to keep weight distributed evenly. If water floods one side faster than it can be pumped out, the ship begins to heel. A slight list can be managed. A worsening one means the balance is slipping beyond control. McSorley was experienced enough to recognize the difference. He'd spent decades on the lakes, knew how a ship should feel underfoot. When he reported the list over the radio, he described it as minor, something the pumps could handle. But the fact that he mentioned it at all told Cooper it was worth watching. McSorley called it minor. Investigators would spend years arguing about whether it ever really was. Shortly after that transmission, McSorley made a decision. He reduced speed, checking down to let the Anderson close the gap. The two ships were now moving in tandem, the Fitzgerald ahead, the Anderson trailing at a distance that kept them within radio and radar contact. The plan was simple. Both captains would head for Whitefish Bay, a sheltered area on the eastern side of the lake where the fetch was shorter and the waves would ease. It was the safest move available, a coordinated retreat that gave McSorley backup and Cooper a clear reference point in worsening visibility. Slowing down also reduced stress on the hull, gave the pumps more time to work, and kept the ship from taking waves over the bow as aggressively. It was a textbook defensive maneuver, the kind of decision that separates captains who've survived 40 years on Superior from those who haven't. But defense only works if you know where you are. Slowing down was supposed to buy him time, but the equipment he needed to use that time safely was already starting to fail. Sometime that afternoon, the Fitzgerald's radar failed. Then the backup failed too. A 729-foot ship, alone in 30-foot seas, had just lost the one instrument that let it see through the snow and spray. McSorley didn't turn back. He radioed the Anderson, running about 10 miles behind, and asked Captain Jesse Cooper to track him on their radar instead. From here on, the Fitzgerald would navigate on borrowed eyes and a compass bearing. It was a workaround, not a fix. Every course correction now depended on a voice on the radio and a blip on someone else's screen, miles back, through a storm thick enough to swallow both ships whole. Blind and slowing down in open water, McSorley needed one more thing to go right, and it was about to go wrong too. Whitefish Point sits at the entrance to Whitefish Bay, the last stretch of shelter before the open lake. Its light and foghorn had guided ore boats into safe water for generations. Every captain on Superior knew that signal by instinct. That day, the same storm tearing through the Fitzgerald's rigging had knocked out the power on shore. The light went dark. The foghorn went silent. No warning was broadcast. No captain out on the water had any reason to expect it. For a fleet already navigating by radio and dead reckoning, Whitefish Point was supposed to be the fallback, the one fixed point in a lake full of moving water. The one landmark that could have guided a blind ship home had gone dark at the worst possible moment. Between 4:30 and 5 o'clock p.m., a ship called the Avafors made radio contact with the Fitzgerald. McSorley asked directly, could they see the Whitefish Point light? Could they hear the foghorn? The Avafors' answer confirmed it. Neither was working. It wasn't a rumor or a guess. It was two crews independently reporting the same dead signal, now sitting on the record. For McSorley, that answer erased his last fixed reference point on the eastern end of the lake. He still had one thread connecting him to the outside world. Now blind on radar and blind on the shoreline, the Fitzgerald still had one thing left: radio contact. That, too, was about to get worse. Somewhere around this stretch of the storm, investigators believe the Fitzgerald passed close to a shoal near Caribou Island, a patch of shallow, uncharted water that shouldn't have been anywhere near her course. The theory holds that heavy seas pushed her south of the shipping lane, close enough to scrape the bottom, or come near enough that the difference barely mattered in 25-foot waves. A hull built for open water isn't built for rock. No one on the bridge reported a collision. No alarm, no distress call about damage. Nothing that would have told the crew their ship had just been wounded. That silence is exactly what makes the theory so hard to rule out, and just as hard to confirm. If she scraped bottom near that island, the ship may have been taking on water long before anyone on board fully understood it. But that's only one theory of several. At 3:30 that afternoon, Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with news no captain wants to deliver. The Fitzgerald had a bad list, a lean to one side that shouldn't happen on a ship riding steady in open water. Both radars were out. He'd lost his fence line, his radar, and now his ability to see the shore, or the ship, trailing behind him, all within the same hour. McSorley added that he was taking some of the worst seas he'd ever been in, a line from a man who'd worked freighters on these lakes for decades. That wasn't a rookie's exaggeration. In the background of the transmission, someone on the Fitzgerald's bridge shouted a warning. "Don't let nobody go out on deck." That shouted warning on the open radio channel was the first sign this wasn't just bad weather anymore. It was a fight to stay upright. While the Fitzgerald fought to hold her list, the Anderson, running 10 miles behind, took a hit of her own. Two rogue waves rose up out of the dark, far bigger than anything around them. The first slammed into her stern and rolled clean over the deck. The second followed right behind it, doing the same before the ship had even shed the water from the first. Crew members watched green water break 35 feet above the waterline, high enough to reach the pilot house windows on a 729-foot ore carrier built to shrug off Lake Superior. The Anderson survived both waves and kept going. If waves that size could do that to the Anderson, the question became what they were doing, right then, to the ship 10 miles ahead of her. By radio, the Anderson could still reach the Fitzgerald. By eye, she couldn't. Snow and spray had swallowed the horizon, and the bigger ship ahead had become a signal on a screen, nothing more. Captain Cooper kept his eyes on that blip, watching the gap close from 10 miles to 9 to a little less. The Anderson was gaining, slowly, the way a slower storm gains on a faster one. But radar only tells you where something is. It can't tell you what's happening on its deck. 10 miles isn't far on open water until you realize it also means help was always going to be too far away. At 7:10 p.m., First Mate Morgan Clark keyed the radio from the Anderson's bridge and asked the question every trailing ship asks the one ahead of it, in weather like this: "How are you making out?" The reply came back from Captain Ernest McSorley himself, steady, almost routine. "We are holding our own." No distress in it, no request for help. Just 5 words that sounded like a ship, doing exactly what it was built to do, taking the waves and staying upright. Those 4 words would become the most analyzed sentence in Great Lakes history, because 10 minutes later, nobody could reach the Fitzgerald at all. Nothing about that transmission suggested an ending. No captain broadcasts calm on purpose right before disaster, not unless the disaster hasn't started yet or hasn't been recognized for what it is. From this point on, there's no more radio to lean on. What comes next has been rebuilt after the fact. Cross-referencing Anderson's radar logs, National Weather Service data, and the Coast Guard's own inquiry, minute by minute, against a silence that starts right here. What actually happened in the next 17 minutes was never radioed to anyone. It had to be pieced together after the fact, one clue at a time. On the Anderson's bridge, the radar swept in its slow, steady circle, same as it had all night. 10 miles ahead, the Fitzgerald's blip sat right where it should be, tracking the same course, the same speed. No one on watch had any reason to think twice about it. Ships don't vanish between sweeps. They fade, they falter, they call for help first. For one more minute, everything on that radar screen looked completely normal. Snow was coming down so hard now, it seemed to swallow the Anderson's running lights whole. Visibility from the pilot house was next to nothing, just white pressing against the windows on every side. First Mate Morgan Clark stayed on the radar anyway, more out of habit than worry. It was the kind of checking you do 100 times a watch without thinking about why. The storm hadn't let up even slightly. If anything, it was getting worse. Clark had no reason to look away from that screen, and in a few minutes, he would wish he never had. By now, the whiteout had closed in completely. Men on the Anderson's own deck couldn't see past the bow, snow moving sideways in sheets thick enough to blot out the water itself. Somewhere out in that same wall of white, the Fitzgerald was taking the exact same beating, but there was no way for anyone to know how she was holding up. No lookout could have picked her out at 10 miles. No lookout could have seen her at 1. In weather like that, radar wasn't a convenience. It was the only way anyone would know what was happening to her at all. At 7:14 p.m., another vessel cut through the static. The Nanfree, a merchant ship riding out the same storm about 20 miles southwest of the Anderson, hailed Captain Cooper on Channel 16. The exchange was brief, professional, the kind of check-in masters make when conditions get bad enough that you want to know who else is out there. They talked about the storm, wind speeds, wave heights, the kind of seas that make even experienced captains uneasy. The Nanfree's master wanted to compare notes, confirm what he was seeing matched what Cooper was reporting. It did. Later, investigators would comb through that conversation word by word, looking for any mention of the Fitzgerald, any hint that something had already gone wrong. The transcript runs less than 90 seconds. Two ships sharing the reality of November 10, 1975, at 7:14 p.m. Even in that brief exchange between two other ships, there was still no reason for anyone to think something was already wrong. At 7:15 p.m., the Anderson's radar operator logged another sweep. The Fitzgerald's blip was still there, still tracking on course, still moving at the speed you'd expect from a loaded freighter, pushing through heavy seas. Range approximately 10 miles, bearing steady. By every measure the radar could give, she was fine. The image on the scope showed a ship doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing, maintaining heading, making way toward Whitefish Point. If something was wrong, the radar couldn't see it. But later analysis would suggest that by 7:15 p.m., the Fitzgerald was likely already compromised. Water may have been flooding compartments below decks. The bow may have been riding lower than it should. Pumps may have been struggling against an inflow they couldn't match. The radar said everything was fine. The ship itself may have already disagreed. If the Fitzgerald was flooding, the crew would have known. Automatic alarms, water rising in the tunnels, the feel of the ship changing under their feet. But knowing you're taking on water and understanding how fast it's happening are two very different things on a vessel 729 feet long. In seas like that, with waves breaking over the spar deck and wind tearing at every structure above the waterline, assessing damage in real time is nearly impossible. You can't see below decks from the pilot house. You can't send a man forward through 25-foot waves to check the cargo hold. You rely on instruments, on pumps, on reports shouted over the roar of the storm. And if the flooding was catastrophic, if multiple compartments were breached, if the bow was already too heavy and the stern too light, the window between manageable problem and ship going down might have been minutes, not hours. On a bulk carrier that size, once the physics turn against you, they turn fast. If she was going down, she may have been going down faster than any radio call could have kept up with. At 7:17 p.m., the Anderson wasn't the only ship watching. A fishing vessel somewhere in the vicinity had been tracking vessels on its own radar, trying to navigate the same howling darkness. Another freighter, the William Clay Ford, was monitoring the radio, listening for traffic. Both reported later that around this time, they noticed something odd. Not dramatic, not a distress call or an explosion, just a quietness where there had been chatter, a gap in the usual back and forth between ships, trying to stay oriented in zero visibility. The fishing boat lost track of a large contact it had been following. The Ford heard nothing on the frequency where the Fitzgerald should have been checking in. Neither thought much of it at the time. Storms mess with radar. Radios cut out. Ships go quiet when crews are busy. Somewhere in these exact minutes, on a radar screen 10 miles away, something was about to change. The last confirmed position of the Edmund Fitzgerald was logged at approximately 46 degrees 59.950 N, 85 degrees 06.6 points W. That's roughly 17 miles north of the entrance to Whitefish Bay, still in open water, still exposed to the full violence of the storm coming down from the northwest. At her normal cruising speed of 16 knots, she could have covered that distance in just over an hour. Even running slower, dealing with damage, fighting the seas, she might have made it in 2. The Anderson, 10 miles behind, was aiming for the same shelter. Captain Cooper had her on his radar, a steady blip moving southeast toward safety, right where she was supposed to be. The waves were still building, the wind still screaming, but the math was simple. Get to the bay, get behind the point, get out of the fetch. 17 miles from shelter, she never covered another one. 7:20 p.m. Investigators would later determine this was the beginning of a 10-minute window, not when the Anderson lost the blip, not when anyone noticed she was gone. The window when the Fitzgerald herself actually went down, based on radar timestamps, witness accounts, and the physical evidence eventually found on the lakebed. Somewhere between 7:20 and 7:30 p.m., a 729-foot freighter carrying 26,116 tons of iron ore sank in water cold enough to kill in minutes, in seas high enough to bury a ship whole. The storm was still raging. The Anderson was still pushing forward. Other vessels were still navigating by instruments, trusting their radar, trusting the next check-in would come. No mayday, no flares. No time for the crew to launch a single lifeboat or pull on a single survival suit. The ship that had sailed through 50 Novembers, that had been called unsinkable by men who built her, went down faster than any of them could react. Somewhere in the next 10 minutes, the largest ship on the Great Lakes stopped existing, and almost nobody realized it in the moment it happened. Aboard the Anderson, First Mate Morgan Clark was doing what he'd done all night, watching the Fitzgerald's return on his radar screen, tracking her position 10 to 17 miles ahead. At 7:10, she was there, a steady echo, right where she'd always been. Then he looked again, and the screen was empty. No flash, no static burst, no signature of a breakup, just clean, empty water where a 729-foot ship should have been. There'd been no distress call, no explosion on the horizon, no flare, nothing on the radio to suggest anything was wrong. For a moment, Clark assumed it was a radar glitch. The storm had been playing tricks on instruments all night. It wasn't an unreasonable thought. Lake Superior's waves were still running 25 feet, snow was falling sideways, and the Anderson's own equipment had been acting up for hours. Clark adjusted the gain, checked the connections, and waited for the blip to come back. It didn't. He scanned the area where the Fitzgerald should have been, then widened the search, thinking maybe she'd changed course without saying so. Still nothing. Other men on the bridge started drifting over to look at the screen with him, the kind of quiet crowding that happens when one person's problem starts to feel like everyone's. 10 minutes passed, then 15, but the longer that screen stayed empty, the harder that explanation became to believe. Captain Jesse Cooper picked up the radio and called the Fitzgerald directly. A routine check, the kind ships exchanged all night in weather like this. No response. He tried again on a different channel, thinking maybe Ernest McSorley's crew just hadn't heard him over the storm. Still nothing. Cooper starting hailing any vessel in the area that might have eyes on the Fitzgerald, or might at least confirm she was still broadcasting somewhere. Every channel came back the same way, empty. 20 minutes of silence on a boat that had been talking to the Anderson all evening isn't unheard of. Radios failed, men got busy, storms swallowed transmissions. But Cooper had been on these lakes long enough to know how these nights usually went, and this wasn't how they went. Silence on a radio channel isn't proof of anything, until it goes on long enough that it becomes proof of everything. At 7:39 p.m., Captain Cooper picked up the radio and called the Coast Guard station at Sault Ste. Marie. He reported what he knew. The Fitzgerald had been in trouble, reporting damage and listing. Then her radar blip had vanished, and she wasn't answering the radio. The Coast Guard operator asked Cooper to confirm the Fitzgerald's last known position. Cooper gave the coordinates, approximately 17 miles north-northwest of Whitefish Point. The operator logged the call at 7:39 p.m., November 10, 1975. It was the first official alert that something had gone catastrophically wrong. A 729-foot freighter, loaded with 26,116 tons of taconite pellets, had simply stopped existing on radar. No mayday, no distress signal, no wreckage spotted. The Coast Guard would want to respond immediately, but the storm that had just swallowed a 729-foot ship wasn't done making that difficult. The Coast Guard station at Sault Ste. Marie had a problem. Their aircraft couldn't fly in winds gusting past 60 miles per hour, with visibility near zero. Their cutters were designed for river and harbor work, not 25-foot seas in open water. The nearest cutter capable of handling the storm, the Woodrush, was docked 300 miles away in Duluth. Even at full speed, she wouldn't reach the search area until the next morning. The helicopter stationed at Traverse City was grounded by the same weather that had just taken the Fitzgerald. So the Coast Guard did the only thing they could. They asked the freighters already on the lake to turn around. The Anderson, the William Clay Ford, the Arthur M. Anderson, ships that had just fought through the worst storm in decades, were being asked to go back. The very ships that had barely survived this storm were now being asked to go back into it, looking for a ship that might already be 40 minutes gone. Captain Cooper turned the Anderson around at 7:54 p.m. He radioed the Swedish freighter Nanfri and the saltwater vessel Avafors, both nearby, asking them to join the search. Both captains agreed immediately. The Anderson had just spent hours riding out 25-foot seas, taking green water over the deck, her crew fighting to keep hatches sealed and cargo secure. Now Cooper was steering back into those same conditions, toward the exact coordinates where the Fitzgerald had vanished. The Nanfri came from the south. The Avafors approached from the east, 3 ships converging on a patch of open water, 17 miles north of Whitefish Point, their searchlights cutting through snow and spray, looking for anything: wreckage, life rafts, survival suits, men in the water. They would spend hours searching the same waters that had just taken 29 men, not knowing if they'd find anything at all. By first light on November 11th, the search crews had found debris, pieces of a lifeboat, shattered and torn, cork life preservers, battered beyond use, an oil slick spreading across the surface, 2 miles wide. None of it suggested survival. The lifeboat had been ripped apart, not launched. The preservers showed no sign anyone had worn them long enough to matter. The oil meant the Fitz's fuel tanks had ruptured somewhere far below. By noon, the Coast Guard had recovered oars, flotation devices, and scattered pieces of the pilot house. Every item told the same story: catastrophic loss, no time to deploy emergency equipment, no one making it off the ship alive. What they pulled from the water that night told part of the story. What they'd find on the lakebed months later would tell the rest. On November 11, 1975, the Coast Guard confirmed what the families already knew. All 29 men aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald were lost. Captain Ernest McSorley, 63 years old, a veteran of 44 years on the lakes. First mate Jack McCarthy, engineer George Hall. The youngest was 20. The list of names ran in newspapers across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Fathers, brothers, sons. Men from Superior, Toledo, Ashtabula, Duluth. Some had sailed the Fitz for years. Others had just signed on for the season. What made this different from other Great Lakes disasters wasn't just the size of the ship or the speed of the sinking. It was that the lake kept them. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Search teams found wreckage, cargo, pieces of the deck, but no bodies surfaced, not one. Not one body was ever found, which meant the only way to understand what happened to them was to find the ship itself. On November 14, 1975, 3 days after the sinking, a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion flew a search pattern over eastern Lake Superior. The aircraft carried a magnetic anomaly detector, gear designed to find submarines. It was looking for 13,632 tons of steel, somewhere beneath 500 feet of water. The crew picked up a signal 17 miles north of Whitefish Point, right where the radar blip had vanished. Sonar confirmed it, a massive object on the lakebed at 530 feet, far larger than anything else down there. But the sonar return showed something unexpected. The wreck wasn't in one piece. The Edmund Fitzgerald had broken apart. The bow section sat upright, relatively intact. The stern lay 170 feet away, twisted and collapsed. Between them, scattered debris, cargo, deck equipment, pieces of the superstructure. The ship that had been 729 feet long was now two separate chunks of hull, separated by a field of wreckage. Finding the wreck answered where she went down. It raised an even harder question about how she got there. The bow lay upright in the mud, still recognizable, still pointed toward Whitefish Bay like she was trying to finish the trip. The stern was 170 feet away, flipped completely upside down, its propeller aimed at the surface. Between them, nothing but debris. Taconite pellets spilled across the lake bed in a trail that stretched for hundreds of feet, along with twisted steel, cable, and pieces of the deck that should never have separated from each other at all. No ship breaks apart cleanly. Whatever tore the Fitzgerald into two pieces did it with enough force to flip an 8,000-ton section of stern completely over on its way down. A ship doesn't break in half like that without a reason, and figuring out that reason would take investigators years, not days. The first real look came in 1976, less than a year after she sank, when the U.S. Navy sent an unmanned submersible down 530 feet to photograph the wreck for the Coast Guard's investigation. The images were grainy, black and white, lit only by the sub's own floodlights, cutting through water that no sunlight had touched in months. More expeditions followed through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, some using remotely operated vehicles, others sending manned submersibles down to sit on the lake floor beside the hull itself. Each dive added a few more photographs, a few more measurements, a few more pieces to a record that investigators, historians, and the families of the crew would study for decades. But cameras only show what's in front of them. They couldn't explain why the steel had failed, or in what order the ship had come apart, or what the crew had known in their final minutes. Those first images didn't settle anything. If anything, they gave both sides of an argument that hadn't even started yet more to fight about. In 1977, after nearly 2 years of hearings, wreck surveys, and testimony from surviving crew of other lake freighters, the U.S. Coast Guard released its official finding. Their conclusion: the Fitzgerald's cargo hatch covers had not sealed properly, allowing water to seep steadily into the cargo hold over the course of the storm. As that water accumulated unseen in the belly of the ship, it robbed her of buoyancy and reserve stability. When the largest waves of the night finally hit, the report concluded, she simply had nothing left to fight them with, and she went under fast, with no time to send a distress call. It was a clean explanation. Human error, mechanical wear, bad luck, all converging on one closable, preventable failure point. That conclusion satisfied the government. It did not satisfy the men who had spent their careers building and sailing ships exactly like her. The Lake Carriers Association, representing the shipping companies that operated vessels just like the Fitzgerald, filed its own dissent within months. Their engineers pointed to a stretch of water near Caribou Island, water the Fitzgerald had crossed just hours before the storm reached its worst. Charts from that era show the area as shallower than official surveys suggested. The theory went like this: if the ship had scraped bottom there, even briefly, it could have fractured hull plates or popped rivets below the waterline. Damage no one on board would have felt or seen. Water could have been pouring into the cargo holds for hours before anyone knew there was a problem. This explanation moved the blame away from the crew and onto the lake bed itself, a hazard no amount of careful seamanship could have detected in the dark. The Coast Guard's own hydrographic office pushed back, insisting their charts were accurate. 2 respected investigations looked at the same wreck and reached almost opposite conclusions, and the wreck itself hadn't finished offering evidence yet. In 1994 and again in 1995, teams of marine forensic engineers went back down to 530 feet, this time with a narrower question: not what happened, but what the metal itself could prove. They studied the hatch covers first, measuring how tightly the clamps had been secured and whether the covers themselves showed signs of failing under pressure from above or from within. Next came the hull plates. Divers and remote cameras mapped deformation across the ship's bottom, comparing how steel bends when it's crushed by external water pressure versus how it tears when a structure breaks apart from internal stress. Those two failure patterns look almost nothing alike to a trained eye. Fracture patterns along the hull got the same treatment, cataloged rivet by rivet, plate by plate, cross-referenced against stress models built from the Fitzgerald's own construction blueprints. Every rivet and fracture on that hull was a clue, and not everyone who examined them agreed on what those clues meant. One theory arrived not from the wreck, but from the water itself. Great Lakes sailors have long described a phenomenon they call the Three Sisters. Not one massive wave, but a sequence of three, each one feeding off the wake of the last, growing taller with each pass across open water. Witnesses on a nearby freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, reported seeing swells over 25 feet that night, some of the largest ever recorded on Lake Superior. Meteorologists studying the storm decades later ran wave models that supported the idea. Under the right wind conditions, three sisters could form and strike a vessel in rapid succession, each wave adding weight before the last one had even drained off the deck. No single buoy or ship's log from that night could have captured a sequence like that in the middle of a blackout. If three enormous waves really hit her back to back, there may have been almost nothing McSorley or his crew could have done differently. But there's another theory, one that has nothing to do with waves at all. Some engineers believe the Fitzgerald's hull was already compromised long before that November night, weakened by decades of heavy cargo loads and the stress of winter crossings. The ship was built in 1958, an era when Great Lakes freighters were designed to bend and flex with the waves, not resist them. By 1975, she'd completed hundreds of trips, carrying loads that often exceeded 26,000 tons. Each crossing placed enormous strain on the keel, the deck, and the welds holding everything together. Over time, microscopic fractures could have formed in the steel, invisible to inspectors, but growing wider with every voyage. On November 10th, the theory goes, those fractures finally reached a critical point. The hull didn't need a rogue wave to fail. It needed only the sustained stress of 30-foot seas, a cargo hold still loaded with 26,116 tons of ore, and the constant pounding of wind and water against a frame that had been flexing for 17 years. If this theory was right, the storm wasn't the true cause of her loss. It was only the moment a much older problem finally caught up with her. In 1969, 6 years before she sank, the Edmund Fitzgerald was cut in half. It wasn't damage, it was an upgrade. Shipbuilders inserted a 120-foot section into her midsection, stretching her from 711 feet to 729 feet and increasing her cargo capacity by nearly 3,000 tons. This practice, called jumboizing, was common on the Great Lakes during the 1960s and 70s. Shipping companies needed vessels that could carry more ore per trip to stay competitive, and lengthening an existing ship was cheaper than building a new one. But not everyone agreed it was safe. Some naval architects argued that cutting a hull and welding in a new section introduced stress points the original design never accounted for. The ship's frame had been engineered as a single continuous structure. Adding 120 feet meant the loads distributed differently. The flex patterns changed, and the welds connecting old steel to new became potential weak spots under extreme conditions. No federal regulation required stress testing after a jumboization. The Fitzgerald passed her inspections and returned to service. But 6 years later, in seas that other ships survived, she went down. A ship modified once already had one weak point built into her. The storm may simply have been the first thing strong enough to find it. Then there's the simplest theory of all, the hatches. The Fitzgerald had 21 cargo hatch covers, each one weighing several tons, and secured by manual clamps that had to be tightened by hand before every voyage. If even a few of those clamps weren't properly fastened, water could seep into the cargo hold with every wave that broke over the deck. Former crew members and dock workers later told investigators that hatch maintenance on Great Lakes freighters was sometimes rushed, especially late in the season when schedules were tight and crews were exhausted. The Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin on November 9th, loaded to capacity. No one saw the crew inspect the hatches that morning, and no record exists confirming they were checked. In calm seas, loose hatches wouldn't matter much. A few gallons of spray wouldn't sink a 13,000-ton freighter. But in 30-foot waves, with green water sweeping the deck every few seconds, even small leaks compound fast. Water pools, shifts the center of gravity, and creates a feedback loop where each new wave floods deeper than the last. The Coast Guard found no evidence the hatches were faulty, but they also found no evidence they were secure. If the hatches weren't sealed properly, then the ship may have been taking on water for hours before that final radio call ever happened. Water entering through compromised hatch covers wouldn't have announced itself. The cargo hold sat below deck, out of sight, and the Fitzgerald had no system to monitor water levels in that space. By the time the crew reported a list at 3:30 p.m., thousands of gallons could have already accumulated on one side of the hold. The list was 1 or 2 degrees, noticeable but not alarming. Captain McSorley mentioned it once, then moved on. But that tilt meant weight had shifted, and in the middle of a storm with waves washing over the deck every few minutes, more water would keep finding its way in, through any gap in those hatch covers. As the hold filled, the ship rode lower. Lower freeboard meant waves reached the deck more easily. More waves on deck meant more water testing every seal, every clamp, every vulnerable point. It's a cycle that feeds itself, and it happens slowly enough that from the pilot house, everything still looks manageable. If that's what was happening, then the ship's fate may have already been sealed hours before anyone on board understood the danger. By 7:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald was riding heavy, sitting lower in the water than she should have been. The exact amount of flooding is unknown, but investigators believe the cargo hold had taken on enough water to reduce her reserve buoyancy to almost nothing. She was still afloat, still making forward progress, but the margin for error had vanished. Then the waves changed. Between 7:10 and 7:25 p.m., the Anderson's radar showed the Fitzgerald disappear. Witnesses on the Anderson reported seeing massive waves during that window, some estimated at 25 to 35 feet, moving in irregular patterns as the storm intensified. The Fitzgerald, already compromised, was directly in their path. The leading theory among marine engineers is that a sequence of large waves struck the bow in quick succession. The first wave pushed the bow down. The second hit before she could recover. With the cargo hold already flooded and the ship riding low, the bow went under and stayed under. Piece by piece, investigators have spent 50 years reconstructing what actually happened in that 10-minute window, and it comes down to one violent sequence of events. When divers reached the wreck, they found both lifeboats still secured in their davits. The emergency radio beacon never activated. No distress call went out after 7:10 p.m. The crew of 29 men had no chance to react, because there was no time to react. Marine architects who studied the sinking estimate that once the bow submerged past a critical point, the Fitzgerald would have capsized and plunged in less than 10 seconds. The ship was 729 feet long, moving at 14 knots, and suddenly, the front half was underwater. The physics don't allow for a slow descent. The Anderson heard nothing. The storm was too loud, the distance too far. By the time they realized the Fitzgerald was gone from radar, The ship had already been on the bottom of Lake Superior for several minutes, broken in two pieces, 535 feet below the surface. Everything the investigators found, the wreck, the debris, the silence, points toward the same terrifying possibility. Whatever happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald happened almost instantly. For 20 years, the Fitzgerald's bell sat 535 feet down, corroded and silent, the only marker of exactly where the ship had come to rest. In 1995, a team led by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society brought it back up, in a joint expedition with the Canadian and U.S. Coast Guards and the Sioux tribe of Chippewa Indians. Family members of the crew asked for one thing in return. "Leave the bell down there with the men," they said, "but bring up something to remember them by." So, divers replaced the original with a replica, engraved with all 29 names, and lowered it into the dark to keep watch in the real bell's place. The original was restored and now sits in a museum in Whitefish Point, rung once a year for each man lost that night. It became the closest thing the families had to a grave, but the lake kept one more secret. When researchers finally mapped the wreck site in detail, using sonar and remotely operated cameras, the picture that emerged was violent. The Fitzgerald lay broken into two massive sections, the bow upright and largely intact, the stern flipped upside down roughly 170 feet away, its hull torn open like foil. Between the two halves was a field of scattered debris, taconite pellets spread across the lake bed in a pattern that told its own story. The ship hadn't settled, it had come apart, fast, with enough force to separate 200-foot sections of welded steel and fling cargo in every direction. The bow section had plowed into the bottom at an angle, driving itself 20 feet or more into the mud on impact. That kind of damage doesn't happen slowly. And inside, investigators found something they weren't prepared for. The pilot house, the command center where Captain Ernest McSorley had spent the final hours barking updates over the radio, was found separated from the rest of the bow. Its windows were still intact, unbroken, which investigators found almost impossible to explain. A slow flooding, a gradual list, should have given the glass time to shatter under pressure, long before the structure gave way. Intact windows on a detached pilot house point to something else entirely, a structure ripped apart in an instant, faster than water pressure alone should allow. If that's what happened, the men in that pilot house may never have had a moment to process what was happening to them. One second, they were riding out a storm they'd handled before. The next, there was no ship left to stand on. No bodies were ever recovered from the wreck itself. All 29 men are still down there, 530 feet below the surface, entombed in what's left of the pilot house and the forward section. The Edmund Fitzgerald is their grave. In 1977, Michigan declared the wreck site legally protected. Ontario followed. Divers are forbidden from entering the wreck or disturbing human remains. The lake became the cemetery they never chose. Fred Shannon's wallet was found during a 1994 dive, leather still intact, photos of his children preserved in the cold water. The dive team returned it to the surface. Everything else stayed below. For weeks after the sinking, the Coast Guard and families debated recovery operations. The depth, the cold, the condition of the wreck made body recovery nearly impossible. Families had to choose whether to leave them there or bring them home. Most families learned from a phone call or a knock at the door in the middle of the night. Cheryl Rosman was 17 when the Coast Guard told her that her father, Watchman Ransom Cundy, wasn't coming back. No body, no chance to say goodbye. Memorial services were held across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio in the weeks that followed. Empty caskets, folded flags, families standing in churches, staring at photographs instead of faces. Some families pushed for more dives, more investigations, believing answers were still down there. Others wanted the site left alone, untouched, a place their loved ones could rest. The Coast Guard closed its inquiry in 1978, calling the cause inconclusive. Ruthie Rafferty, whose husband Bob was a steward on the Fitz, spent decades attending survivor reunions for other Great Lakes shipwrecks, listening to men who made it out. Her husband didn't. One question never stopped haunting them. Could they have survived if the ship had stayed afloat just 5 more minutes? The Arthur M. Anderson was 17 miles away when the Fitzgerald vanished. In ideal conditions, a helicopter from the Sioux could reach the site in 22 minutes. But Lake Superior in November is 38 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, unconsciousness sets in within 15 to 30 minutes. Death from hypothermia follows in under an hour. Even if crew members made it to life rafts, the waves were still running at 25 feet. Dennis Hale, the sole survivor of the 1966 sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell on Lake Huron, lasted 38 hours in a life raft in similar conditions. He was the only one of 29 men who didn't freeze to death. His survival was called statistically impossible. Engineers who studied the Fitzgerald's final minutes say that if Captain McSorley had turned back toward Whitefish Point after 7:10 p.m., the ship might have limped into shallower water before going down. But the storm itself wasn't finished. The Coast Guard's investigation took over a year. When it finished, the recommendations piled up fast. Mandatory depth finders, better hatch clamps, survival suits stored where crews could actually reach them in a storm. Some changes came quick. Weather reporting on the lakes got more frequent, more precise, tied closer to real-time buoy data instead of scattered radio checks. Other reforms moved slower. Hull inspection standards tightened, but the shipping companies pushed back on the cost, and some fixes took years to become law instead of months. The freighters still on the water got retrofitted, one by one, welded and reinforced against exactly the kind of failure that took the Fitzgerald down. And yet, November storms still claim ships. At 7:10 p.m., the Anderson's mate radioed the Fitzgerald with a routine question. He wanted to know how she was making out, holding up in the wind and the 10-foot seas. Captain McSorley's answer came back steady, almost flat. "We are holding our own." That was it. 6 words. No distress call. No mention of the water they'd later find had been pouring in for over an hour. No one on the Anderson thought twice about it. It was the last anyone ever heard from the Fitzgerald. 17 minutes later, the Fitzgerald was gone. 7:10 p.m. McSorley's voice, calm, over open water. 39 minutes walk from Whitefish Point. Sometime near 7:15, investigators believe the flooding reached a critical point, likely a sudden loss of buoyancy at the bow, dragging her down before anyone below could act. 7:20 p.m. The Anderson's radar operator looked for the Fitzgerald's blip and found nothing. No flare, no call, no wreckage spotted in the dark and the driving snow. 29 men gone in a stretch of time shorter than a commercial break. The lake never gave an answer. Sailors have a name for Lake Superior. They call it the graveyard of the Great Lakes, and it earned that title honestly. The lake holds an estimated 350 wrecks, and the cold keeps its dead. At 40 degrees Fahrenheit near the bottom, the water is too cold for the bacteria that would normally break a body down. That's why crews still respect November on Superior. The gales that sank the Fitzgerald weren't rare. They come every year, driving 25-foot waves across 350 miles of open water with nowhere to hide. Modern freighters carry radar, GPS, and satellite weather, and they still wait out the worst of it in harbor. The Fitzgerald is the most famous name on that list. But she wasn't the first, and she wasn't the last. The lake keeps taking, quietly, on its own schedule. As of today, the wreck lies undisturbed. She rests 530 feet down, broken into two main pieces on the floor of Whitefish Bay. The bow sits upright in the mud. The stern lies overturned about 170 feet away, and between them spreads a field of taconite pellets, the cargo she was carrying that night. Time works slowly down there, but it works. The hull has been settling and corroding for decades, and each survey shows a little more decay than the last. Remote cameras and the occasional crude submersible have visited over the years, mapping the damage, but no one lifts anything anymore. In 1995, a dive recovered the bronze bell, and after that, Canada and Ontario passed laws protecting the site. Diving on the wreck is now restricted. It isn't a curiosity or a salvage yard. It's a grave for 29 men, and it's left alone. Every November 10th, families and strangers gather at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. The recovered bell hangs there now, cleaned and mounted, and a new bell was placed on the wreck in its stead, inscribed with the 29 names. During the ceremony, the bell is rung 29 times, once for each man who went down with her, and a 30th time for every mariner ever lost on the lakes. Some in the room are children of the crew. Some are grandchildren who never met the men whose names they carry. 17 minutes. That's all it took for a 729-foot ship and everyone aboard to vanish without a single distress call. 50 years later, the lake still hasn't offered an explanation, and the people who loved those men still show up to listen for one. As of November 2025, the bell still tolls. This story isn't over, not even close. The Fitzgerald wasn't the first big laker to vanish without a radio call, but she was the biggest. She stretched 729 feet, the length of a 73-story skyscraper laid on its side, and yet she was only 75 feet wide. That ratio, nearly 10 to 1, is what naval architects call a high length-to-beam design, and it's efficient for hauling ore. It's also structurally punishing in a following sea, because a wave that long can lift the bow and stern at the same time, while the middle of the hull sags into a trough. By the time the storm reached its worst, hindcast models built by NOAA and the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory put sustained winds at 50 to 60 knots, roughly 57 to 69 miles per hour wind. At that speed, over open water generates waves around 24.6 feet on average. But averages don't kill ships. The same models identified a single rogue wave, a freak swell that can rise far above the surrounding sea state, forming at the exact time and place the Fitzgerald went down. Great Lakes sailors have a name for a specific kind of danger, the Three Sisters. It's a sequence of 3 waves in quick succession, each one arriving before the ship can shed the water from the last. The first wave floods the deck. The second arrives before the scuppers can drain it. By the third, the ship is carrying thousands of extra gallons of water it was never designed to hold, and that weight sits high, right where it does the most damage to stability. The Fitzgerald's plimsoll line, the mark that shows how deep a ship can legally sit in the water, was only 11.5 feet below her deck. That's a slim margin. On a calm day, it's more than enough clearance. In 25-foot seas, waves don't need to be freakish to roll clean over the deck. They just need to be taller than 11.5 feet, which on Lake Superior that night was most of them. Captain Bernie Cooper of the Anderson, trailing about 10 miles back, watched 2 waves on his own radar that he estimated at 25 feet, then a third that he believed topped 30. He would later say he watched those waves roll up over the Fitzgerald's stern and roll forward across her deck. He never saw them come back off. That detail, water going on and not coming off, is part of why investigators keep returning to flooding as the likely chain reaction. whatever first let the water in. One theory for how the water got in points to 6 Fathom Shoal, a shallow patch near Caribou Island, where depths drop to as little as 11 feet in spots. A nautical investigator hired by the ship's parent company later reported finding scrape marks and traces of the Fitzgerald's maroon paint on the shoal itself. If she grazed bottom there, the impact could have cracked or torn her hull below the waterline, and in 25-foot seas, a captain might never have felt it separate from the pounding of the waves. McSorley had also been awake for roughly 24 hours by the time the worst of the storm hit. Some researchers who've studied the wreck point to something called motion fatigue, the same disorientation that comes from hours on a violent roller coaster, as a factor that could have dulled his judgment on an unfamiliar northern route, sailed with outdated charts and no functioning radar. The 2 federal investigations that followed didn't agree. The Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation, released in 1977, pointed to failing hatch covers that let water pour into the cargo hold, gradually stealing the ship's freeboard, the distance between deck and waterline, until the sea simply overwhelmed her. The National Transportation Safety Board, in 1978, leaned toward the shoal theory instead. 50 years on, maritime historian Fred Stonehouse has said plainly that the exact cause will likely never be confirmed. What both reports agree on is the timeline's brutality. The Coast Guard concluded the sinking happened so fast that no lifeboat was ever launched and no mayday was ever transmitted, even though the crew had been in routine radio contact with the Anderson only minutes earlier. There was no scramble, no warning. One moment she was there on the radar screen, the next she wasn't. In 1994, an expedition using a remotely operated vehicle located the body of a crewman near the bow, still wearing a life jacket. It remains the only human remains ever documented at the site. The following year, 2 scuba divers became the first people to physically touch the wreck since it went down, an act that helped push Canadian authorities to require a permit for any future dive, after years of unregulated expeditions to the grave. If this one stayed with you, there are more waiting on the channel. Subscribe and keep going.